Fort Henry Hard Rock and Heavy Metal is made possible in part by grants from the 4 Point Sheraton Hotel in Kingston, Ontario, and Assurance Solutions in Kingston, Ontario.
Standing on a hill overlooking Lake Ontario and the port of Kingston, Ontario, is the garrison of Fort Henry. Built to defend the town of Kingston, the Rideau Canal, and the naval dockyard in the 1830s, it was the largest and most costly fort constructed west of Quebec City. The fort was a strategically crafted 19th century state-of-the-art fortification fashioned out of solid limestone.
Prior to the War of 1812, there was just, this was a wooded area known as Point Henry, and during the War of 1812 it was identified that this area is very significant because the area just down to our west is Navy Bay, and that was where the British naval establishment was on Lake Ontario. It became very evident very, very quickly that if you had a high area of land that was in cannon shot, which we were, then that was a really significant place for defense of a nature, and that's when they decided to build a fortification up here.
Point Henry was named after Sir Henry Hamilton, the first Lieutenant Governor of Quebec in 1782. There were actually 2 forts built at the site of Point Henry. Construction of the first fort began in 1813 during the War of 1812, but the fort's role in the war was relatively minor.
First fort was something that progressed during the War of 1812 from a simple blockhouse at the beginning through a more evolved fortification based on what's known as a Vauban system that has projections out from the side walls and bastions on the corners, etc. The principal portion of that, though, was a lunette or an advanced battery that gave cannon fire out onto the Lake Ontario. The other significant feature of it was 2 stone towers that were in the northern end of the fort that were able to mount cannon as well. That fort was dismantled, though, and during the 1830s, when they had a serious reconsideration of British strategic fortifications in this area, and the second fort was constructed on top of the first fort. So there's almost nothing left of the first fortification. This fort, the second fort, was constructed between 1832 and 1837 for the principal part of the fortification, the lower redoubt. Then, following that, a few years later, in the 1840s, they constructed the advanced battery, which is the roof section that sort of projects out towards the lake. And then the final piece of the fortification were the 2 towers that were built at either ditch end, and those were constructed in 1846 to 1848.
Fort Henry is a dual-purpose fortification built to defend against both land and water attacks. During the War of 1812, a naval dockyard occupied the land to the west of the fort, where the Royal Military College of Canada now sits. The dockyard was the strategic shipbuilding site for the area. Major guns were mounted on the advanced battery facing Lake Ontario in an offensive posture. However, it was much more likely that an attack would come from land to the north of the fort. Attackers would have landed further down the St. Lawrence River and advanced overland to the fort. Thus, the major frontage of the fort itself faces to the north. Life at the fort was not easy. Wages were small, and soldiers and officers alike were expected to pay for their uniforms, food, haircuts, and other necessities. Even during the hottest days of summer, the soldiers wore heavy wool uniforms. The wool was somewhat flame-resistant and helped protect the soldiers against the sparks when they fired artillery and guns. The red tunics of the infantry soldiers were the national color of the British Army and were consistent with the line volley tactics of the rifles then in use. Soldiers stood solidly in the ranks on the battlefield and did not take cover to avoid fire. Obedience within the ranks was an integral part of military life. When the rules were not followed, punishment was swift and sure. Fort Henry has 10 cells used to incarcerate soldiers. The most common offense was drunkenness, but other crimes such as lateness, poor turnout, and insubordination gained offenders severe consequences. In 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed, and the British